Good evening, everybody. Can everybody see the screen?
Yep.
Excellent.
Absolutely.
Before we get started, Craig, would you like to pray for us tonight?
Oh, sure. Heavenly Father, thank you for this church history study that we're doing here, and I pray that you would use it to help our minds to know who we believe and all that you've done for us in a better way, that we could have a more full experience of your grace and love in our life and be able to live lives that are glorifying and pleasing to you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well,
Amen.
We're going to be continuing part 2 of our study of the pagan world tonight. And next week, I guess we will be jumping into church history proper, so to speak, as we talk about the life of the Lord and talk about the advent of our Lord Jesus Christ. But tonight, we're going to be covering the right column here from our overview of last week. As you can see, we have lots of very nice Latin titles here. But we will discuss these as time goes along. But with that, I'll go ahead and jump to our next slide for today. And so we're going to be talking about ancient Rome, or as in Latin they called it, Roma. So would anybody like to, I guess, sort of offer their thoughts on, like, when the words Rome or the Roman Empire is mentioned, like, what are some things that initially come to mind?
Architecture for sure. And a lot of political intrigue.
Rome was certainly known for both of those things. But yeah, the Romans were sort of master engineers of the ancient world, and many of the buildings that they constructed are still with us to this day. Anybody else?
Was the kind of the center of the Western Church, right?
Yeah, especially the foundations of sort of Western Christianity lie within the Latin language and sort of the Italian peninsula. That's the one part of what later becomes the Christian West that's actually in the New Testament. The rest of it takes place in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. But so certainly the city of Rome is kind of the foundation for the Western Church. Well, we're going to start off tonight kind of in the middle of Roman history, depending on how long you think Roman history goes, but that'll be for another episode. So I have a quote here, and this comes from a Roman governor in Bithynia by the name of Pliny the Younger. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was actually a victim of the eruption at Mount Vesuvius, which destroyed the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum in the year 79 AD. But Pliny the Younger goes on to become a governor in the province of Bithynia, which is in Asia Minor. And he is writing to the Emperor Trajan near the height of the Roman Empire. This is a very interesting quote. It's very historically significant in the history of the church. And I've named this title of the slide Carmen Christi. Does anybody know what the Latin phrase Carmen Christi means?
About Song of Christ.
Yes, that's correct, Craig. Good job. Yes, it means Song of Christ, or the Christ song in Latin. And it's often applied to Philippians chapter 2, which some people have said could be potentially a fragment of a hymn of the early church. We don't know. But Pliny has this to say as he is talking about the various affairs of his province. He comes upon a group of people that he needs some advice from the emperor on how to deal with them. So he says, they asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God, to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again to partake of food, but an ordinary and innocent food. And so, as you can imagine, Pliny is writing to the Emperor Trajan about Christians. And this is actually our first sort of extra biblical, extra Christian source that we have for the early church. So this is the earliest non-Christian source that we have on Christians. And it's kind of an interesting little passage tucked away in a letter in which Pliny is asking the emperor, what do I do with this people? And he goes on in this particular section to describe what the Christians do. So are there anything that sticks out to y'all as the class?
Is he being ironic there? Like when
what
he
about
says
being
that
ironic?
well, he says the sum and substance of their fault or error. And then he goes on and he seems to say good things, at least we would call them good. Do you think he was being ironic in what he was saying there? Or did he really think that there was fault in what they were doing?
So that's a good question, Craig, and we'll get into that. But if you were a pagan Roman, and we'll discuss Roman culture as we go into this, and that's a very good question. Would you see this new cultus, this new superstitio, as the Romans would have said it, as a good thing or as a bad thing?
I mean, it seems like he sees it in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not committing a crime.
Yeah,
which was
of
kind of
course.
what Luke was trying to do in the book of Acts, right? He was trying to write to the Romans to show that Christianity was not a threat necessary to their government, but that Christians could be good citizens. You know what I'm saying? So I think it seems like some of that's getting across that Christians can be good citizens of Rome.
Yeah. What does the rest of the audience have to think?
I think it sounds like he views them as very peculiar.
Yeah.
I guess that's what I gather from it.
Yeah, this group of people, these Christians, they're not like other cults, I think is what he's saying. He still sees their religion as faulty or an error, but they're very strange. They're not like what he has encountered before in his religious experience. We kind of talked a little bit about this last week, but there were many different cults that existed in the Roman world. When I use the word cult, I'm using it in a technical sense, not in a pejorative sense, where you have particular gods or particular customs or rites that are observed, oftentimes in certain locales. But these Christians seem to have very strange practices that are different than many of the other cults that would have existed in that day. But why do you think they were meeting on a fixed day and specifically before dawn?
Because they're assembling before Christ was risen, or I guess like it symbolically, I guess.
That's a good guess. What's thought about this is that who comprised the majority, or what social classes, what kinds of people comprise the early Christian church?
The working class.
Yeah, exactly. Whether free or slave, they were kind of the working class. They were kind of people lower down on the totem pole of society. I believe there was a later pagan writer who scornfully dismissed Christians as a religion of slaves and women, um, as opposed to the sort of noble uh, religion of conquering Rome. So yeah, they had to meet at dawn because did they have a weekend in the ancient pagan world?
Nope.
No, they didn't. So they actually had to meet before dawn so that they could actually meet on a fixed day, which is likely Sunday, the Lord's Day. And they had to meet because as soon as the sun was up, they had to go to work. And so that's why they would meet at dawn.
Hmm.
But yes, perhaps there's a little bit of double entendre with the symbology that they're meeting with the dawn on the day of the Lord's resurrection, and they dismiss the service as soon as the sun is risen, um, just as Christ is risen from the dead. But yeah, there's probably very practical reasons as well why they would be meeting when they would be meeting. Um, and when he talks about food, this is something we'll get into in subsequent lessons. This may be a reference to the love feast, the agape meal that the early Christians would take, as mentioned briefly in the book of Jude. But Christians would gather together, and it looks like they certainly sing, and there's teaching that's going on. There's an assertion of doctrine, but there's also fellowship that is occurring as well. And so, yes, this is our first non-Christian account of Christians and their practices. So, Roma Invicta, and I'm using the classical Latin pronunciation as opposed to the ecclesiastical Latin. And I put the question mark at the end because Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, which is a great book about how Christianity created the modern world, and I think I referenced this in our last lesson. He says this: in a city famed for its wealth, Paul proclaimed that it was the low and despised in the world, mere nothings, who ranked first. Among a people who had always celebrated the agon, the contest to be the best, he announced that God had chosen the foolish to shame the wise and the weak to shame the strong. In a world that took for granted the hierarchy of human chattels and their owners, he insisted that the distinctions between slave and free, now that Christ himself had suffered the death of a slave, were of no more account than those between Greek and Jew. And so what Holland is really referencing is just the vast chasm that exists in the pre-Christian world to the post-Christian, or the sort of post-advent of Christianity world, between every aspect and every facet of sort of daily life, both in terms of social relations, in terms of morality, in terms of religion, in terms of the very views of life and death themselves, that the advent of Christianity revolutionized the world. It's easy for us to look back upon, especially in our very woke age, and to assume that people always cared for the ones who are lesser than or who are the least of these. But that was not the case in the ancient world. And it certainly was not the case with Roman civilization. And what Holland is showing is that Christianity had a sort of world-changing impact that few of us today can appreciate because we don't necessarily appreciate what came before because we're over 2,000 years removed from that culture and from that civilization. And so I have this little sort of summary here that in order for us to understand the seismic impact that the advent of the Christian religion had upon our world and upon us as Western man, we must first understand what preceded it what was that civilization of the Caesar, the philosopher, the poet, and the slave, which gave way under the imposing shadow of the cross? And so, with that, we will begin our study of Roman history all the way back in what we ascertain is the year 753 BC, according to legend. Ab urbe condita. Does anybody have an idea of what this Latin phrase means? It's often abbreviated on Roman coins as AUC.
Hmm.
From the founding of the city.
Yes, exactly. From the founding or the building of the city, ab being the Latin from, and then urbe, where we get our term urban or city, and then condita is the building of. So, like somebody's condition. So, from the founding of the city, and that's how the Romans marked their calendar, was from the legendary founding of the city by its founders, the twin boys Romulus and Remus. So, according to legend, as I mentioned in the last episode, the Bronze Age collapse, which took place in approximately the year 1177 BC, that the memory of this event, this sort of cataclysm in the ancient world in which many of the civilizations of the second millennium BC all of a sudden collapsed at the same time, that this memory was not just limited to Greece or to the Eastern Mediterranean, but it also was remembered in the West. According to legend, as the city of Troy was being destroyed, Aeneas, who was the son-in-law of the king of Troy named Priam, escaped with a few survivors, and he made a very long and circuitous journey from Troy and ancient Asia Minor down to Carthage and other places in the Mediterranean world. But eventually, he and his surviving band of Trojans arrived in central Italy in the plain of Latium. Now, how much of this is historical is to be determined. But this is at least how the Romans saw their own history. And so Aeneas and his men settle there. I think he wins the heart of a princess, and they settle, and they essentially become a part of this people who call themselves the Latins. And so 10 generations on from Aeneas's fabled journey, on April 21st, 753 BC, his descendants, the twin boys Romulus and Remus, founded the city of Rome on the banks of the Tiber River in this region of Italy called Latium. And here is a sculpture over here. Does anybody know the legend behind this sculpture here?
I do not.
Was someone raised by wolves?
Yes. So this is the she-wolf, and this is thought to be potentially as early as a 5th century BC Etruscan figurine. Won't talk too much about the Etruscans today, but they were a pre-Roman Italic people who lived to the north of the city of Rome, and much of Rome's early history was defined by its interactions with the Etruscan people to their north. But this is thought to be a reference to the she-wolf, that when Romulus and Remus were born, they were born, I guess, the grandsons of the king of the city of Alba Longa. Well, that king was overthrown by his, I think it was either his brother or his nephew. And so the boys were essentially hidden by their mother and guarded by the river god Tiber, the Tiber River. And they ended up being found by this wolf, this she-wolf. And the boys ended up nursing at the teats of this she-wolf and were kept safe from their murderous relative who had taken the throne from their grandfather. Well, they grow up and they overthrow the wicked relative, and Instead of, and I believe they restore either their grandfather or their father to the throne in Alba Longa, but instead of settling back in Alba Longa, they and their followers decide to found a new city in the Latin plain, and they call this city, after the surviving of these two twins. So both of the boys were made kings by their followers, or rex. That's where we get the Latin term rex is king. And so Romulus and Remus have a falling out in terms of how the new city should be run. And in single combat, Romulus kills his brother Remus and becomes the sole king of this new city, which he names after himself, Roma. And he appoints 100 of his most loyal followers to help him rule this new city. And this ruling council is called the Senate, named after Senex, which is Latin for old man. So these are the fathers, the city fathers, the patricians, so to speak, of the new city of Rome. So for the next 250 years after the legendary time of Romulus, Rome was ruled by a series of kings, some of whom were of Etruscan origin, as I mentioned earlier. And eventually, the inhabitants of the city grew tired of what was often tyrannical rule by these kings. And so in the year 509 BC, the Roman Senate, led by Lucius Junius Brutus, and yes, there is a connection there, to the famous Brutus of the Caesar assassination, they overthrew the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, which means Tarquin the Proud, and established a new form of government called a res publica, which the term res publica, it's kind of a funny phrase. It's the public thing or the public matter. The res being the thing or the matter. It's a translation of the Greek term politeia, which connotes the idea that power is vested in the common citizen, either directly or via elected representatives, rather than in an absolute monarch who is appointed so by the gods. And so you may remember from our discussion on Demokratia, or democracy, the city of Athens around the same time had established a democracy in Greece. And so representative republic is being explored in the sort of primitive West in a way that the Eastern world, in a way that was unknown to the Eastern world. And so it was almost unheard of outside of maybe ancient Israel with the time of the judges that there would be anyone other than a king ruling over a people. And so just like the Greeks to the east who had their own forms of representative governments, the Latin people here in the city of Rome were experimenting with their own form of non-monarchical government. And so they appointed two of their own, the Senate did, and these two men would rotate every year, and so you'd only serve one term. You had two men who would rule the city for 1 year terms, and these were called the consuls. And so you can see the two consuls here in this painting, and there's their lectors there in the back. And for the rest of the period of the ancient Roman Republic, the fear of a return to monarchy was a driving force in Roman politics. Any questions on the Republic and the founding of the Republic?
How big was the empire during this time as compared to, like, is this an empire that just grows over time, or is there a certain peak to its growth, and what year was that?
Yeah, we're certainly going to discuss that as time goes along. At this time in 509 BC, the Republic is essentially confined to the city of Rome and just a few very small surrounding territories. So this is a very tiny place. And so Rome has very small beginnings on its rise to global superpower. And so no more than a city and maybe a few surrounding plots of countryside and some very small towns in the surrounding area. And so, yeah, Rome is very small at this point in its history. There's a number of things that kind of defined life in the Republic, or vita in res publica. The Roman Republic was governed by an unwritten constitution. Now, we have a written constitution in our form of government. And yes, our founders certainly looked to the Roman Republic as one of the many sources that they drew inspiration from in terms of founding our own republic here in the United States. But unlike our republic, which has a written constitution, their republic had an unwritten constitution. And social class and tradition played a major role in society. As I mentioned before, Rome was divided, well, not as I mentioned before, but I mentioned the class of patricians. These were the men who were the descendants of Romulus's original Senate. So those original 100 men, their descendants were known as patricians, and they made up the very top of Roman society in the Republican era. And the sort of hoi polloi, the mass of the free Roman citizens who were the predominant class in terms of numbers. These were the plebeians, which I believe comes from a Greek word pletho, which is like the fullness or the mass. So it's referring, this is the majority of the people. They cannot claim descent from those original 100 city fathers. And so they're just kind of the normal people. Within these two broad classes, you have a number of sort of subclasses based off either property or other sort of qualifications. So within the patrician class, you had a number of property requirements for sort of subclasses within the patrician order. And you had the Senate at the top. So these were the men who essentially made up the ruling council of the city of Rome, and you had to have a certain amount of land, a certain amount of money in order to be considered a senator. You had equites, who the closest thing I could say to these are knights, eques being the Latin term for horse. And so these were often the warrior elite who served under the Senate, who made up the sort of citizen soldier of the Roman elite. And then you had a number of other classes with the proletariat sort of being at the bottom of the property classes. And many of these were plebeians. You had a number of different sort of offices within the Republic. So you had the censor and the consul and the praetor and the aedile and the tribune and the quaestor and the promagistrate and the legate. And all of these serve different functions, everything from making sure that the city streets were clean to the city water supply and the aqueducts working properly, to collecting taxes, to enforcing the legal code. All of these different sort of magistracies had their own sort of function and role to keep order within the Republic. Citizen households were headed by a paterfamilias, literally the father of the family, who had complete authority, which the Romans refer to as patria potestas, over those of his own household, including his wife's children, dependents, relatives, and slaves. And that is, a paterfamilias could even kill his own son on a whim, just by holding this patria potestas. And so the paterfamilias, as you can tell, this is kind of a very patriarchal society that the Romans have developed. There was also a client patron system that developed in the early Republican era, in which you had a wealthy patron would fund and protect a client in exchange for services rendered. And this was a fundamental relationship in Roman economic and civic life. We see this especially later on in the late Republic as different political parties develop. You would have wealthy senators would literally pay rabble from the mob to vote for them in the upcoming elections. And so that's where we get our term patronage, or like the company Patreon today gets its name from this system of civic life. And the economy at this time, like most economies in the ancient world, was largely agrarian, with production of grains, olives, and grapevines as key staples. Industrialization is really something that, so long as a society has sort of large and almost limitless supply of cheap labor, the incentive to develop machines to do work is just not there. And so Rome, like all ancient societies, was largely a rural agrarian society, even though it had a level of urbanization that was unrivaled compared to prior eras. And so we continue on with our sort of history of the Republic. As Craig mentioned, around 509 BC, this little dark area in the sort of darkest red, this is about as big as Rome was at that time. So, like I said, the city of Rome, Ostia down here, which was the port city at the mouth of the Tiber, and just a very small sort of hinterland that the Romans controlled. However, over the succeeding centuries, the Romans engaged in a series of expansionist wars on the Italian peninsula. And there's a number of social changes that happen in Italian life that slowly expanded the idea of who was considered a Roman. As the Romans conquer or absorb cities, whether through military conquest or through treaties, they begin to extend certain degrees of citizenship to their new domains. So you had the sort of citizenship cive. So that's the highest level of citizenship, which is somebody who is literally a citizen of the city of Rome itself. Then you had what was called the Latin Rite, or the cives Latinus, which was extended to Rome's allied cities in the plain of Latium, and then slowly begins to be extended to other Italian peoples as Rome expands its authority over the Italian peninsula. So there's a number of conquests. Obviously, they look to their near abroad first and conquer their fellow Latin tribes from the years 743 BC to about 341 BC. And there's also struggles even within the city itself. The plebeians are constantly struggling and trying to fight for rights and equality under the law with the patrician class. In the year 390 BC, Rome has a very traumatic event, and that is that a Celtic tribe from up here in the very north of Italy and sort of southern France sweeps down into the Italian peninsula and actually sacks the city of Rome. So they breach the city walls and loot the city and set fire to certain buildings. And the Romans never forgot this. And their sort of modus operandi from that time forward is to always make sure that the eternal city was impregnable. After Rome conquered its near abroad with the Latins, they then set about conquering central Italy and the other non-Latin peoples in the Italian peninsula. So peoples like the Samnites and the Etruscans and the Umbrians. The Samnites down here, the Etruscans obviously to the north, the Umbrians right here. And so Rome is slowly expanding outward in a series of wars until by the time you get to the year 264, Rome has basically come into possession of the vast majority of the Italian peninsula. And as Rome is expanding in Italy, obviously the Greeks are kind of doing their thing in the east. There is another power in the Western Mediterranean that is also expanding at this time. And Rome comes into conflict with this other power. Does anybody have an idea of who that other power is?
Carthage.
Yes, exactly. The Carthaginians. Carthage was a colony of Phoenicians from ancient Lebanon, which we read about the cities of Tyre and Sidon in the Bible. And so the Carthaginians are descended from the peoples of Tyre and Sidon. The term Punicus, which is the Latin term for Carthaginian in the Roman vernacular, comes from the very word Phoenician. And these people are actually descended from the biblical Canaanites. And so they have a number of Canaanite practices. They worship Baal, for instance. They engage in child sacrifice. But the Carthaginians actually have developed an almost sort of mirror image government and society to the Romans. They also had what was the Romans called the Carthaginian Senate. Now, what the Carthaginians called their ruling council, they had their own sort of Punic or Phoenician name for this ruling council, but it effectively served as a counterpart in Carthage to the Roman Senate. And so, whereas Rome was a land-based power, where we think of the legions and the sort of mighty Roman legions, Carthage was a naval power. So they were keen on building ships and exploring. As you can see, Rome is based in this single strip of land on the Italian peninsula, whereas Carthage has holdings from Morocco all the way into Libya. They have holdings in Sicily and Corsica and Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, as well as in Spain as well. And so they are kind of defined by their naval prowess. Three separate, very bloody wars were fought between Rome and Carthage over control of the Western Mediterranean. As you can see there, the First, Second, and Third Punic Wars. Rome, as the kind of underdog in the First Punic War, is able to actually defeat Carthage. And a lot of it is that the Romans actually build a navy from scratch and learn how to get really good at boarding Carthaginian ships so that they can turn naval engagements into land-based engagements on ships. And after this decisive victory, the sort of ruling or leading family in the Carthaginian Senate, the Barcid family, the father of whom, Hamilcar, was one of the only generals to kind of have success against Rome in the First Punic War. His son never forgives the Romans for the humiliation that they had inflicted upon Carthage in the First Punic War. And so he vows to avenge the honor of Carthage. And this is, of course, Hannibal Barca, the great Hannibal, who crosses the Alps with his elephants, basically taking a route from Spain all the way up through here and surprising the Romans from behind. And the Second Punic War was a bloody 17-year-long war of attrition in which the Carthaginians win many major battles at the beginning of the war, like Trasimene, and then obviously the very famous Battle of Cannae in 216, where Carthage killed 60,000 Roman soldiers in one day. But because of its superior political organization, its professional army, which was a really big factor, Carthage mainly employed mercenaries, whereas Rome had a citizen professional army. And Rome's strategic adaptability, Rome eventually, even with all of these catastrophic tactical defeats, wins the strategic victory at the end of the day. And by the end of the Third Punic War, Rome destroys Old Carthage. In the words of Cato the Elder, Carthago delinda est. That is, Carthage has basically been deleted. Carthage is no more. Rome destroys Old Carthage and then actually rebuilds a new form, a new Carthaginian city, and Carthage enters its Roman period. And many famous early church fathers are actually North Africans from Roman Carthage, as we'll discuss in subsequent lessons. And so after Rome defeats Carthage in the Punic Wars, this left the late Republican Roman government with its first provinces and expanded its political dominance beyond Italy to the point where Rome had now become the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. And so after the Punic Wars, as well as there are some related wars in the East, Rome is actually conquering Greece also in the 2nd century BC. oddly enough, the city of Corinth, which we read about in First and Second Corinthians, had been destroyed about 2 centuries earlier by the Romans, and then also rebuilt as Roman Corinth, and that was Rome's conquest of much of mainland Greece around the same time. And so, after the Punic Wars and Macedonian Wars, Rome had greatly increased in size. And so this increased size and scope of the Republic began to put a strain upon the Republican form of government, especially upon its ruling class. And the allure of one-man rule began to surface once again among the rich and powerful in the city of Rome. Does anybody know? Has anybody ever seen this movie over here on the right? Recognize these actors? Come on, guys. Anybody ever seen Spartacus, Kirk Douglas in 1960?
Yep.
Laurence Olivier?
I've been sheltered.
Maybe we'll have
That's
to do
terrible.
some ancient, we'll have to watch some of these sword and sandals movies from a better time. So that's an allusion to what is going to come next. So the first sort of ambitious political family that we see in this sort of late period of the Republic after Rome's finished conquering Carthage and much of Greece, you have the Gracchi brothers who are appointed tribunes in the cities. And so they try to introduce reforms to give the plebeians more rights, because with all these, new conquests, the Roman elite now have many more slaves that they can use for cheap labor. And so the common working class Roman man is being pushed aside by cheap labor. And so they can't pay for their farms anymore. And so they're selling them to the senatorial class. And so there's a tremendous amount of economic inequality that begins to build up in the late Republican era. And the Gracchi, as good populists, are eventually killed by their rivals in the Senate, mobs that had been whipped up, client mobs by senators. And so the Gracchi fail to bring about the necessary reforms. And so this spiral of ever increasing economic and political inequality within the Republic begins to spiral towards an inevitable sort of bridgehead. A decade or so later, you have the rise of the first sort of great man in the late Republic, and this is Gaius Marius, who's possible bust. We don't know if this is actually him now, but it's traditionally been attributed to him. Marius is unique in that he serves an unprecedented 5 straight consulships. And he's able to do this because as Rome is expanding, it begins to encounter new barbarian tribes on its frontiers. They fight the Jugurthine War, which is named after Jugurtha, who is the king of the Numidians, which is in modern-day Algeria and Morocco. And so they're expanding in North Africa. And he wins this war. And then there is another war that he fights where this is the first time the Romans are really encountering Germanic tribes. And this is the Cimbrian Wars around the year, 105, 106 BC. And Marius is sent with the legions to fight against the Cimbrian tribe as well as the Teutonic tribe. And he wins that war as well. And so he has amassed all of these sort of military honors and serves 5 straight consulships. However, Marius is not without his own challengers. A former, I don't necessarily know friend, but a former colleague of his, Cornelius Sulla, is another sort of ambitious Roman general. And Sulla is more traditional in his way of doing things. He actually wants to honor the sort of tradition of the Republic and fears that Marius is gaining too much power. And so Sulla, with many supporters, fights a civil war against Marius and defeats Marius. And Sulla is actually declared dictator of Rome, which this is not what we think of when we think of dictator. Dictators were not permanent, at least not yet, in the Roman Republic. They would only arise when the the necessity was there. And so they'd basically be given over all power over the army as well as the political system temporarily in order to set things straight. And so Sulla defeats Marius, he restores the Senate to its place, and then he actually retires and dies a couple of years later. However, there was a young man that who was actually a relative of Marius who escaped Sulla's purges of sort of Marius's supporters, and that was a young man by the name of Gaius Julius Caesar, or we would say Julius Caesar. And Sulla once had Caesar before him, according to the histories, and said, "I see many a Marius in you." And Sulla presaged the future greatness of this young Caesar. The Third Servile War occurs during this time, which is a very large slave rebellion. As I mentioned earlier, much of Rome at that time, perhaps as much as a third to a half of the population in Rome's territory were slaves. And so the conditions of the slaves were very, very poor. And so you have Spartacus over here, played by the dashing Kirk Douglas, leads a revolt and actually develops a slave army and goes about burning and pillaging the Italian countryside. And he's eventually stopped by Marcus Licinius Crassus, who will come up shortly thereafter. And Crassus, played by Laurence Olivier here, is the richest man in Rome. There's a story about Crassus that if a building would catch fire in Rome, Crassus basically owned so much of the functions of the city. He owned the fire department, or the ancient equivalent thereof, and he would come to the burning building's owner as the building was burning, and he would actually charge them money in order to put out the fire. And so Crassus amasses the most wealth that any Roman had to that point, and he becomes the richest man in Rome. But Crassus is not a very likable figure for probably obvious reasons. And so he needs political support to help in the aftermath of Sulla's retirement, help run the Republic. And so he enlists two other men, Pompey, who is a former supporter of Sulla, and then that same Julius Caesar. And these three men form what is called the First Triumvirate, where they essentially support each other. And through the fancy patronage client system, they actually come to have more power than the entire rest of the Senate combined. Well, after Crassus dies in an ill-fated campaign against the Parthian Empire to the east, the Parthians ruled Persia at this time, and they are mentioned in the New Testament in the book of Acts. Caesar and Pompey's alliance begins to fray. Pompey had actually married Caesar's daughter, and when Julia, Caesar's daughter, dies in childbirth, the die was cast for a showdown, or as Caesar says, "Jacta alea est," the die is cast. So after the Senate, under Pompey's influence, orders Caesar, who is fresh off of his conquest of Gaul, which is modern-day France, to relinquish his command and return to Rome in order to be tried for certain financial crimes that Caesar had committed, Caesar refuses to lay down his arms, and he makes a fateful decision in 49 BC to cross the Rubicon River from Gaul back into Italy with his armies, thereby declaring civil war against the Roman Senate. And here is Caesar with his legions crossing the Rubicon River. He wins the ensuing civil war against Pompey and the Senate, but he is then assassinated by the Senate on the Ides of March. Beware the Ides of March, as Shakespeare would say, which is the 15th of March in 44 BC, after having previously been appointed dictator for life. And so the Roman Senate, led by Cassius, as well as Marcus Brutus, who was a descendant of the original Brutus who helped found the Republic, And there's the legends say that Brutus felt a family obligation because even though Caesar was his friend, he saw that Caesar was quickly becoming a king. And as a descendant of one of the founders of the Republic, he felt it was his obligation to help take down this aspiring king in order to restore the Republic. However, when Caesar, after his death, his will was opened, the Roman Senate and people were shocked to learn that he had left everything to his only legitimate male relative. And does anybody know who that male relative was?
I remember Charlton Heston reading the will, but I don't remember what he said.
Well, everything goes to Caesar's grandnephew, a young, I believe he was either a teenager or early 20s by this point, young man named Gaius Octavius. And so there is a civil war that develops after Caesar's death. Cassius and Brutus, the liberators, fighting for the Republican ideal, end up coming up against Mark Antony, who is Caesar's co-consul, Marcus Lepidus, who is Caesar's master of the horse, one of the men who helped lead his legions, and the young Gaius Octavius, who is Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son. So since Caesar had no legitimate sons of his own, he did have one son with the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, but he had no other living male relatives besides Gaius Octavius, and so he adopts his sister's grandson as his own son. And so Octavius, Lepidus, and Mark Antony defeat Brutus and Cassius in the Liberators' War, and they rule Rome for the next few years as the Second Triumvirate. However, after forcing Lepidus in 36 BC into exile, the young Octavian, as he is now being called, launches a war against what he calls the degenerate lover of a foreign queen. Egypt was not a part of Rome at this point, and Mark Antony, instead of being a good, moral, upstanding Roman and fulfilling his obligations as a Roman citizen, decides to go marry Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and live a rather debauched lifestyle of an Eastern monarch. And so Augustus is saying this man wants to be a king over us, and so we need to overthrow him because he's threatening the Republic. Well, little did the Roman people know that in supporting Octavius, they were going to have their king soon enough. So Octavian defeats Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and he invades and conquers Ptolemaic Egypt, and Antony and Cleopatra commit suicide. And so now the entire Roman world is in the hands of one man in a way that it had never been before. And Octavian is voted a number of titles by the Senate. Princeps Senatus, that is first citizen. Pontifex Maximus, that is the high priest of the Roman imperial religion. Consular Imperium, which means he has full authority over all of the armies of the Roman Republic. And also Tribunician Potestas, that is tribunician power to veto anything that the Senate gives him. So if you were to ask, does this sound like a first citizen or does this sound like a king? Which does this sound like? So it's pretty obvious. And so with all of these amassed titles, Octavian is great at keeping the facade of the Republic going while essentially becoming a monarch. And because his adoptive father and granduncle had been deified by the Roman Senate, Augustus was now claiming to be the Son of God as well. And so you can see how the Gospels are making an apologetic against this kind of pagan religion, because we know there is another Son of God who is the true Son of God, as opposed to Augustus. And so in 27 BC, the Roman Senate, in honor of establishing the peace that Augustus does and unity throughout the Roman orbs or the Roman world, they vote him a new title, and that is Augustus, which is essentially the exalted one. And this is the title by which all future Roman emperors would come to be called. And so before we discuss the imperial period, does anybody have any questions?
I have one about the Pompeii guy in the prior slide. Was the city Pompeii named after him by chance? The one that had the volcano in it later on?
I don't
Or is
know.
that
I don't think so. I think it was a different spelling,
right?
but it may be related in some way. I would have to go check on that.
I didn't realize that Caesar was a surname of Julius, because later on they used it to designate the kind of the emperors before they became Augustus.
Yeah, so that's actually a good point that you're bringing up, Craig. The Romans had a different naming system than we have, because we have obviously English being a Germanic language. We have a Germanic naming convention for our names. We have a first name, a middle name, and a last name. That's not how the Romans named themselves. Most Romans had a first name of that was selected from about 12 different first names like Lucius and Gaius and Marcus. And so pretty much every Roman man had one of those like 12 names as their first name, but they didn't really use their first name. After their first name, they actually had their surname or their gens. So that was the family. So Gaius Julius Caesar came from the Julii family. And so Julius was essentially his last name. So where does Caesar fit in? Well, that is his cognomen or his known name. And these are what most people come to be known by, is the name that they're called by. And so you can amass a number of cognomens over your course of your life. So you have like Gaius Julius Caesar, Sabinus, Germanicus, Parthicus, Augustus. And so they just keep piling on cognomens at the end of their names, and as they continue to gain title and prestige. And
Are
so,
they sort of adjectives, like descriptive?
yes, they are in a way. So like if somebody has the cognomen severus or severus, what does that mean? That means they're a severe person, or they're a strict person. If somebody has a last name like Felicitas, that means they're a happy person, or something of that. Now, these could also be inherited from father to son, hence why all the future emperors are known by either Caesar or by Augustus, because they're inheriting these cognomens as they assume power. But yeah, so does that kind of answer your question, Craig?
Yeah, that was amazing. I didn't know any of that.
Yep. So before we discuss the imperial period, I want to discuss a little bit about Roman religio, because we need to know a little bit about, well, what did the Romans believe in terms of their religion? Now, much of their polytheistic beliefs are inherited from the peoples around them. The Greeks, as we discussed much of Greek mythology last week, the Romans basically had the same mythos as the Greeks. They called Zeus Jupiter in Latin, which is Deus Pater, the All Father, which is actually the same root as Zeus. Jove is another surname for Jupiter, or another name for Jupiter. The Greek god Ares becomes the Roman Mars. The Greek goddess Artemis becomes the Roman Diana. The Greek Aphrodite becomes the Roman Venus or Venus. And so on and so forth. So many of the same gods that I mentioned last week, the Romans had those same gods as the Greeks. They also inherited deities from the Etruscans and other sort of local Italian deities as well. But remember, just like the Greeks, there is no singular paganism. Paganism is not an organized religion in the way that Christianity or other world religions become. There was no one paganism. There were paganisms. every town had its own cult shrine to its own particular god or its own particular variant of Jupiter or Zeus, or the other main gods that existed. And religion in Rome was both conservative and liberal at the same time. It was conservative in the sense that the Roman state, the Senate, and later the emperors, control what kinds of cults, what kinds of religious practices are allowed. And anything that was seen as ancient, even if it was not Roman. So Judaism, for instance, was an ancient religion. And therefore, Judaism was tolerated by the Roman state because it pre-existed the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, and sort of Mithraism, which are sort of religions native to the Iranian plateau. Even though they're coming in from the east, Rome kind of tolerates these things because they're old. And this is called the mos maiorum, and it's essentially the mode or the pattern of the ancestors, that you want to be conservative. You don't want to be going out too crazy on a limb with some sort of newfangled belief system. And it would be much in the way that we would view sort of cult leaders today. Anything that's sort of new or novel is suspicious. And so Christianity, as well as other novel rival religions, such as Manichaeism, which we'll talk about in a later talk, since these were new and novel, they were suspicious because they didn't have ancient sanction. However, the Romans could also be liberal as well, and that is they did, in fact, absorb many foreign practices, especially from Egypt, the cults of Osiris and Serapis and Isis. You have obelisks in Rome, and there was Egyptomania within Rome, in which people would dress like Egyptians and worship Egyptian deities. But also within the Roman army, as they're fighting many wars against the Parthians, they encounter the sort of Iranic deity of Mithra. And so Mithraism, which we'll discuss in subsequent videos as coming from the East, is also brought into the empire. And the focus of the Romans, unlike us, where we're focused mainly on faith and on morality, they're focused on protocol and ritual. And so the reason you do this is so that you may appease the gods who have certain rites and observances, liturgon, or liturgetto, as we would call it, liturgy, or latria. These are the terms that will be used for worship in the New Testament. These had specific technical meanings within Greco-Roman civilization. And so the focus was you need to do the public sanctioned rites and observances because the entirety of the Roman state and the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is dependent upon you, faithful citizen or dutiful citizen, to do your civic duty and go worship the gods in the approved manner, which you might understand would bring certain groups of people who don't worship the gods in the approved manner or who refuse to worship any other gods into suspicion by the Roman state. In their domestic life, each family had their own shrine. This was called the Lararium, where they would have the Lararies, which was the Lares, which are the family idols to be kept. And so they would do all of their dutiful, burning of incense and stuff on a daily basis to their own sort of family carvings of the various idols that would be in their home. And as I mentioned before, like the Greeks, there was no centralized paganism, but many different local cults that were all brought together under the auspices of the Roman state. The imperial cult, which develops after Augustus, I think it must be said, because cannot tell you the number of times I've kind of raised an eyebrow when I've heard pastors say the Romans worshipped their emperors, and it's like I slap my hand on my face. No, no, no. The Romans did not worship living emperors, at least in the West. This starts to happen later on in the East. But within Italy and North Africa and Gaul and the sort of Latin speaking portions of the empire, it was seen as un-Roman and too associated with kingship to actually worship a living emperor. No, emperors had to wait until they died in order to be worshipped by the people of Rome. And the Senate had to approve their consecration, at which point the spirit of the emperor would undergo an apotheosis in which he would be enrolled in the college of the gods, and they would only be worshipped after death. While the emperor was alive, though, offerings could be made to the genius of the living emperor, which was his familiar spirit. And that is where we get our term genius. But it's the idea that you have it's almost like, and the early Christians, I think, rightfully called this idea demonic, in which you had this almost, supernatural, extra person that would lay upon the emperor, giving him guidance. And so you could sacrifice to that spiritual genius, but not to the emperor's actual person. Not all religious practices, though, were approved, as I mentioned earlier. There was something called superstitio, and these were beliefs or practices or even cults that were, at least initially, the way that the etymology works, that super, that you're going over and beyond what is necessary. So magical spells and potions and, sort of esoteric books, worshiping uh, foreign gods kind of underground in secret ceremonies, or consulting diviners who were not the state sanctioned sort of priests, could get you into trouble. And one such superstitio was that of the Christians, because it was believed to be, because it was something that was not sanctioned by the state. So now we move into the imperial period. Any questions on religio before we move on?
The one question I had was, I see some parallels between some of that religion practices and the later developments in Roman Catholicism, like the saints or the rich, like the liturgical attitude of just doing something.
Oh, we'll get
Is
into
that
that.
is that pushing that too far, or do you think that
No, no,
some
no,
of those
no.
things, some of those
You're
things
there.
bled into Christianity?
There is definitely a connection between hagiolatry and the sort of worship of saints and angels that develops in the early church, and sort of icon worship and that kind of stuff in pagan practices. There's definitely a connection there.
Was that one of the major importance of why we're studying some of this history, is because we start to see where some things come from that may not be intended by God? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, church
Yeah.
history and why we're studying it is we ultimately want to see the unfolding of God's faithfulness over time in the history of his people, even amidst both external pressure from the world as well as the internal pressures of sin and the flesh that so easily encumber us. And so the story of Christianity and the story of church history is the church both overcoming external persecution and also being ever renewed and ever sanctified internally from error and heresy. We are, in our own individual lives, living, in a sense, a historical narrative that God has prepared beforehand for us to walk in. And like the lesser example of our own lives, you can see this greater example in Christian history, generally speaking. Any other questions?
I have a small question about um, just the pagan practices with Rome or their Roman religion.
Yep.
If there wasn't like centralized, oh, what's the verbiage? I guess no like decided we believe this for this, like what makes a Christian is like Trinitarian and like a list of other
Or a holy
specific
book like the Bible.
beliefs. Right. Was it like individualistic with like just related themes? I guess that's like
Far from it. Far
odd.
from it.
Okay.
Remember what I talked about earlier, the idea of the mos maiorum, the tradition of the ancestors.
Mhm.
This was sort of an organic, and that's really what paganism is. The word comes from, pagus or hill, or field. The idea that these are the country dwellers in the later Christian period who were worshiping in the way that the ancestors worshipped. And so a lot of this was sort of organic from the ground up. Various tribes, various peoples, various cities had ancient practices, ancient traditions that they held on to, in sort of an organic way that developed. And so you didn't necessarily need an organized religion in paganism, because every sort of locale had its own sort of ancient history and ancient tradition, and ancient religious practices that they were holding on to. Now, you do bring up a great point, though, Tori, because in the 4th century, the last pagan emperor, a man by the name of Julian the Apostate, who is Constantine the Great's nephew, he actually does try to develop a singular paganism, because paganism begins to recede. You have all these disparate, non-unified sort of local cults that, yes, the Roman state has some sort of organization and handle on, but most of this is through custom and it's through tradition. He saw that Christianity, through its organization, through the bishops and the charity that the Christian church provided, the masses of the people were turning to the Christian church, because the local cults did not provide them, both the temporal and eternal satisfaction that, people are longing for. When people would get sick or family members would die, the Christian church was there to take care of people in a way that pagan religion had no interest in. And so Julian actually develops his own pagan sort of priesthood and official pagan practices, but this attempted repaganization of the empire fails because Julian is killed in an untimely fashion.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So more organic development
Yes,
over time.
with more social pressure, providing the sort of boundaries of what was accepted and what is not, based off of tradition.
Mhm.
All right. Any other questions? If not, we're going to move on to the next phase of Roman history. So the genius of Augustus, as I mentioned earlier, was that he essentially and effectively achieved the powers of a monarch while maintaining the facade of republican institutions and iconography. From 27 BC onward, Roman civilization would be defined by the Augusti, that is, the emperors. The Pax Romana, which is traditionally dated from 27 BC to 180 AD, was inaugurated by Augustus with his elevation by the Senate to the title of Augustus. And this ushered in 2 centuries of unprecedented peace and prosperity, in which the Roman state was able to build roads, secure shipping lanes across Mare Nostrum, which means our sea. They literally turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake, as you can see here over on the right. And they facilitated cultural exchange on a scale that was unknown in the ancient world for the duration of this. Alexander's empire certainly was very large, but it ceased being a unified political entity upon his death. That was not the case with Augustus. Augustus built a much more lasting political order than Alexander the Great did. So the demography at this time, approximately 60 to 70 million people were estimated to live in Rome at the height of the Pax Romana, which is about 20 to 25% of the entire Earth's population. So nearly a quarter of the world lived within the borders of the Roman Empire. Approximately 15% of the empire at this time were slaves. A much larger percentage, well, I'll get to that in a second. So about 15% were slaves, and only about 5% of the population within the imperium at the time of Augustus were Roman citizens. And that percentage did expand to about 20% on the eve of the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD. The rest were peregrini, which means those sort of across the field. And yes, that is related to the term peregrine falcon. And the idea is that a peregrine falcon like changes nests, it kind of migrates between nests. And so the peregrini, as the Roman soldiers were coming across the various lands, these were the sort of, they weren't slaves, they were free people, but they were not citizens. They didn't have legal rights or legal authority in the way that Roman citizens did. And we see this in the New Testament. When we see Christ and his disciples, or many of the people in Israel, or Paul, when people are shocked when he says he has Roman citizenship. That's because it was the assumption of most Romans when they were out in the provinces. Maybe, Italians had Roman citizenship, or at least a lot of Italians had Roman citizenship. But if you went out to Spain or Judea or Asia Minor or Britannia, maybe only about 1% of the population had Roman citizenship. And so you could see how in a city like Philippi, which was granted the status of colonia, which is where Rome would settle its soldiers after they had done their 20 years of service. Philippi had a great deal, many Roman citizens, which was rare for the provinces, but that's because it was a colonia. And so you can see how Paul's use of that term, where he says, but our citizenship is in heaven, that he is pointing the Philippians, many of whom actually would have had the rare benefit of being Roman citizens. He's saying, no, there is a better citizenship even than Roman citizenship. So many of these institutions and many of these words we see repurposed by the apostles in the New Testament to teach greater truths. And so Christ and his disciples were peregrini. They were free peoples. They were not slaves, but they were not citizens of the empire. And so this was the vast majority of Roman citizens Roman inhabitants up through the early Severan dynasty, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The maximum extent of the empire was from modern-day Iran all the way over to Scotland, and this was achieved under the Emperor Trajan. So an absolutely massive political entity for the ancient world. And it achieved its maximum land area about 80 or so years later under Septimius Severus, who is the first African emperor from modern-day Libya. There were two periods of the Roman imperial era. The Principate was the first, and this is where the Roman emperors ruled with the facade of republican ideals as the princeps, or the first citizen, in concert with the Roman Senate and the average citizen. However, after the crisis of the 3rd century, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, in the year 285 AD, Roman emperors no longer had the republican facade. They were very much monarchs in this second period. And that is the period of the Dominate, where the Roman emperors were called the Domus, or Lord of the land, and they became absolute monarchs. And does anybody notice something interesting about this date range down here? The question is, what year did the Roman Empire end?
Is that the Holy Roman Empire thing?
Nope.
No,
Has anybody ever heard of the, what was that again, Taylor? You were about to say it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was it looks 1400s. That's
Yeah. Did the Roman Empire really last almost to the time of the Reformation?
huh.
Remember,
about.
we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I won't spoil it for you guys just now. But yes, the Roman Empire actually fell in 1453 AD, and I'll get to that shortly. And that will become a major sticking point in church history. So the organization of the empire, at least during the Principiate or the Principate period, you have the senatorial provinces, which were like Gallia Narbonensis and certain parts of like Illyria, like Dalmatia or Macedonia. These were all the sort of inner provinces that were protected from barbarian invasion. And so these were ruled by the Senate, whereas the emperors would rule the imperial provinces, which were on the exterior of the empire, so like Hispania or Britannia or Egypt down here. These were all the domain and the province of the emperor himself. And so the emperor took charge of the outer provinces to prevent barbarian invasion. And so with that, we're now going to talk about the various Roman dynasties. And I know these names and time periods may be a little burdensome, but this is a couple of slides that you can return to in our subsequent lessons, because many of the events that we're going to see in the early church, in order to understand the context in which they're taking place in, you have to understand what period of Roman history and which period of the Roman Empire they're taking place in. So for over a century, Augustus and his heirs held the title of princeps. This is the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which is named after two families who are related to one another through marriage. The Julii family, which is Julius Caesar, and obviously his grandnephew, who becomes the first Roman emperor, as well as the Claudii, I Claudius, the famous British sort of TV show about the Emperor Claudius. They were related by marriage. So Augustus married Livia, who is related to Drusus Claudius, or Claudius Drusus. And it was a rather scandalous thing because Augustus was all about morals and not allowing divorce. But he forced Livia to divorce her first husband, Drusus, who is a member of the Claudii family. I believe Drusus died shortly thereafter. But Livia was a crazy woman. Many of the Roman emperors had a number of pathologies and probably demon possession. But needless to say, through his marriage with Livia, Augustus inherited two adopted sons, one of whom would die in battle, Drusus, the younger, and the other of whom was a constant headache to him throughout his reign. But by the end of his reign, he was the only male left in Augustus's family, and that was Tiberius, who was Livia's son and Augustus's stepson. So Augustus lives from 27 to 14, and the birth of Jesus happens during his reign, sometime around 6 to 4 BC, which we'll discuss later on why we have those dates. You had the famous Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, in which the German tribes destroyed 3 Roman legions when the governor Varus, blundered his way in there and got killed. And Augustus, is screaming on the Palatine Hill, "Varus, give me back my legions." It was one of the few setbacks that Augustus had during his reign. But he dies in 14 and is succeeded by Tiberius, who rules for 23 years. And it is during the reign of Tiberius. And this is the 14 AD. That is Tiberius's sole reign. Jesus' public ministry begins in the 15th year of Tiberius. But there's some question as to whether that is from when Tiberius ruled after the death of Augustus, or when Augustus had appointed Tiberius as his imperial heir, which happened a few years earlier. And so I kind of give a guesstimate of when the life and ministry of Jesus was. Somewhere between 27 and 33 AD is what we think. Pentecost, 30 AD, 33 AD, depends on which reckoning you want to use. And the conversion of Paul probably also happens during Tiberius's reign, about 3 to 4 years after the events of Pentecost. Caligula, who is the nephew of Tiberius, but is a descendant of Augustus, because Augustus did have female descendants. I believe his mother was Augustus's granddaughter or great granddaughter who had married, I forget. No, Germanicus. That's right. Germanicus, who was Tiberius's nephew. Caligula would have been his grandnephew. But anyways, Caligula was related to both Augustus and to Tiberius, and through Augustus's daughter, and then also through Tiberius's brother being his father, or Tiberius's nephew being his father. Yes, that's right. So his first 6 months were great, but then he got sick, woke up insane, and killed a bunch of people and got himself killed by the Praetorians. Not much is known about the early church during Caligula's reign, which was very short. Caligula was then succeeded by his uncle Claudius. And we really start to get into portions of the book of Acts during the reign of Claudius, which was from 41 to 54 AD. He's known in secular histories for the conquest of Britain in 43 AD. With the general Vespasian, along with the general Agricola, or not Agricola, it was somebody else. But yeah, Vespasian is involved in that campaign. A number of events in the book of Acts take place during Claudius's reign. The famine that is mentioned in Acts 11, the expulsion of the Jews from Rome occurs around 49 AD. This is where Paul meets Prisca and Aquila, as they were Jews who were living in Rome who leave, and Paul meets up with Aquila because he's a tent maker just like Paul is, and Prisca and Aquila become a very important couple in the epistolary literature of the New Testament, and were big supporters of Paul. Paul's first 2 missionary journeys probably also take place during this time, in which the brother of the famous Roman orator Seneca, the proconsul Gallio, is actually mentioned in the New Testament. And so we can see the connection between the story in Acts, which it's not a fable, it's not a myth. When we're reading the Acts of the Apostle, we're reading the early church's interaction with a real historical place and a real historical time period, where real externally verifiable events are occurring. Perhaps some of the first books of the New Testament are written during Claudius's reign, maybe James, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Galatians, possibly 1st Corinthians. Some of the very early letters are possibly written during Claudius's reign. However, Claudius dies, and then he is succeeded by his adoptive son, and the last biological descendant of Augustus that we know of, and that is the Emperor Nero, whom I will refer to as the Antichrist, being a good partial preterist. He killed his own mother, he killed his own wife, he killed his adopted brother. He was known for partying and drunkenness. One of his future drinking buddies will become an emperor as well. Very flamboyant guy, would like to go into the arena and act, fancied himself an actor, which actors were considered lower than prostitutes at that time in Roman history. So he scandalized the Roman nobility. And it is during Nero's reign that most of the New Testament is written. And the events that kind of lead up to the culmination of the New Testament, the Great Fire in Rome in 64, followed by the Neronian persecution, as I believe Tacitus writes, that everybody in Rome thought that Nero set the fire, since it broke out in the portion of the city where Nero just so happened to be building his great Domus Aureus, his great golden house. He wanted to build a house of solid gold to live in. there's the megalomania for you. But the fire coincidentally broke out in that part of the city, and so a lot of people thought he was clearing the land for his golden house. And so, in order to avoid suspicion, Nero turns the blame to a fledgling superstition that he had probably become acquainted with by meeting one of its leading religious figures, and that is the religion of Christianity. And if it's to be believed that Paul actually did have a trial in front of Nero, which is what the last chapters of the book of Acts are about, then it's quite possible that that is where Nero got his information on Christianity from. And that sadly, he was not converted by the preaching of the apostle. And so the apostle Paul and Peter, according to tradition, are martyred under Nero during this time. Paul at Trefontaine, the three fountains, where legend says Paul's head, as it was chopped off, bounced 3 times, and with each bounce, where the location of those bounces were, a spring sprung up. A natural, cool-watered spring would spring up. So the 3 fountains, which is a place just outside of Rome, and that's the traditional site of the martyrdom of Paul. And also during this time period, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, this is the beginning of the First Jewish-Roman War in 66 AD. And it is during this time period that Nero begins to have a falling out for his obvious profligacy and sort of growing megalomania, that the Senate decides to act. And so in 68 AD, the Roman Senate, fed up with Nero's rule, declares him a hostis or a hostis, that is an enemy of the people. And so Nero commits suicide at his villa in the year 68 AD in the month of June. And 4 men in the subsequent year will engage in a civil war for the imperial throne. And this is known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, which January of 69 AD, Galba is emperor, and by December of 69 AD, Vespasian, who was leading the Jewish war out here in Syria and Judea, he is able to win the civil war and found a new dynasty in which he and his 2 sons, Titus and Domitian, will rule in succession. And so because their gens, their family name was Flavius, and they were from the gens Flavii, this is known as the Flavian dynasty. So Vespasian's an interesting character. He was known as the mule breeder among the Romans because he made his fortune breeding mules for the Roman army. He was of plebeian ancestry, actually, and was born into the equestrian class, not the senatorial class. But by the time he had, by the time 69 AD had rolled around, he had gained enough property and enough money, and had obviously served as a general in the Roman army. He had gained enough power and prestige to be let into the senatorial class. And so he was a Roman senator by the time that he becomes the emperor. After the profligate spending of Nero, he stabilizes the treasury. There's a famous saying in Italian, does money stink? Because he actually taxed the public urinals to help balance the budget. He ended the Jewish war in victory and began a failed conquest of Scotland, and also began a building program in which he began building an amphitheater for the people of Rome on the ruins of Nero's Golden House. And this is what we now know as the Colosseum. It's possible the New Testament was completed during his reign, and he patronized the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, which we discussed 2 weeks ago. And he stated on his deathbed, in good keeping with what we discussed earlier, I think I am becoming a god. And then he crapped himself and died. So what a way to go. His 2 sons, Titus and Domitian. Titus was the older of Vespasian's 2 sons, and he was a very competent ruler, but had terrible circumstances. And the Jews like to say it was a curse for destroying Jerusalem and the Jewish temple. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum happened during Titus's reign, and there was also another fire in Rome, as well as a plague that broke out in 80 AD. And Titus is thought to have potentially died of that plague the next year, but he was the one who actually completed the Colosseum. And here's a picture of what's left of the Colosseum. It is still standing today. Domitian then takes over as the younger of Vespasian's two sons, and he introduces an autocratic rule, self-styling himself as a domus, presaging what is to come in subsequent centuries. And he is beloved by the people in the army, but he is hated by the Senate. A lot of assassinations of senators, and he begins to lose favor because he has a failed war against the Dacians, who are a very hostile, well-armed and very organized group of tribes to the northeast of the Roman Empire in modern-day Romania. And the Dacians actually force a treaty upon the empire in which Rome, as the imperial power, had to pay tribute to the Dacians. And so this led to a lot of discontent among the senators. And so he is assassinated in 69 AD. It's possible that John was exiled during Domitian's reign, and that the Johannine epistles, as well as the book of Revelation, is written during his time frame. There's another theory that says Revelation was written around 70 during the time of the destruction of the temple. I'll leave that for whatever your eschatology is and whichever scholars you want to believe. But it's thought to be that at the very least, the New Testament was completed by the reign of Domitian. And this is also when we begin to get the first extra-biblical Christian works. So things like First Clement and the Didache, which we'll discuss. After Domitian's assassination, you have about 100-year period of really good rule, and this is the apogee of the Roman Empire, the 5 good emperors of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, in which 5 consecutive emperors rule who are essentially adopted by their predecessor. And so the best man is essentially selected for the job. And this is one of the problems with the Roman imperial system, because it has an unwritten constitution. There's no set plan of succession when an emperor dies. Unless he is named a successor, it's kind of up in the air. But there's a period of stability here in which Nerva, he stabilizes the relationship between the Senate and the imperial palace, and he adopts the popular general Trajan as his son, since Nerva was childless. And so he stabilizes things, and then Trajan begins the expansion of the empire to heights that it had never known before. He was of Italian origin, of Roman origin actually, but was born in Spain. So he's the first emperor born outside of the Italian peninsula. He reverses the misfortunes that had happened under Domitian against the Dacians, conquering them in the Dacian Wars, and this is an inset from Trajan's column in Rome, which details the Dacian Wars. However, he's less successful in his second war, which is against the Parthian Empire to the east, and he reaches the Persian Gulf, but he remarks that he is too old to conquer the world, unlike the younger Alexander. And Ignatius of Antioch writes during his reign. And also, as we saw earlier, Pliny the Younger gives us our first extra Christian source for the early church, primary source from the early church. His younger cousin Hadrian, who's his only living male relative, then takes over after him. Hadrian is a very cosmopolitan individual. He's fond of Greek philosophy. He's the first emperor to wear a Greek-style beard instead of the sort of clean-shaven Latin look that we see earlier. And he is the one who finally destroys the Jewish population in Judea in the Third Jewish-Roman War, the Bar Kokhba Revolt. And Jews would not become a majority in the land of Israel for another 19 centuries after the time of Hadrian. And he renames Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina after his own family name, and then renames Israel as Palestina, where we get the term Palestine. Even though he was married, it's thought that he was a homosexual because he had a gay lover named Antinous, and he actually deified this gay lover. So even though he was competent, as you can tell, the morals of the Roman emperors are not the best. He then adopts Antoninus Pius, who is a senator and a distant relative of his, on the condition that Antoninus adopt the young Marcus Annius Verus, who will then be renamed Marcus Aurelius, whom Antoninus then had married off to Antoninus's daughter, since Antoninus had no sons. And so he essentially adopts Marcus as his son, and Marcus is his son-in-law by law. And so Marcus is essentially Antoninus' son. This is the most peaceful time in the Roman era. There are no wars started under Antoninus, and Roman merchants reach as far east as the court of the imperial China. And so Rome is at its height under Antoninus. However, towards the end of his reign, it's thought that he was lax towards emerging foreign threats. And during his reign, we have the martyrdoms of Polycarp and Justin Martyr. At the end of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, we come to a very tragic figure in Marcus Aurelius, whom, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, Marcus is, sort of the tragic figure. He was a Stoic philosopher, actually by training, who was able to assume the imperial purple. And so he was Plato's ideal philosopher king. Here's a quote of his from his famous works, The Meditations. It is not death that a man should fear, but rather he should fear never beginning to live. While he was a very capable and very able and very wise emperor, there were a number of tragedies that beset him. He had 13 children with his wife Faustina, Antoninus's daughter, but I believe only 3 of them, or 2 or 3 of them, lived to adulthood. The vast majority of them died shortly after birth or early in childhood. So he had a lot of personal tragedy. He was beset by wars on all sides. The Parthian War from 161 to 166, which, even though the Romans win, there were a number of early setbacks that were quite embarrassing. Marcus was not ready to lead the armies upon his accession. And then even after winning the war, his troops bring back the Antonine Plague from the east, which wipes out 10% of the population of the empire and ultimately claims Marcus's life a few years later. He does have a co-ruler at this time named Lucius Verus, who dies from the plague in 169. And then the Marcomannic Wars, which are the first major war of a series of wars that will eventually lead to the empire's undoing, at least in its western provinces. The Marcomanni were a Germanic tribe to the north of the Danube and to the east of the Rhine. And unlike the Germans in Augustus's day, the German tribes, and by the time of Marcus's day, 150 years later, these are no longer small tribal peoples wearing bear skins charging into heavily armored Roman legions. Many of these German tribesmen had actually served in the Roman military as auxiliary troops to the Roman legions. And so they have weaponry every bit as good as the Romans, and they're now forming large tribal confederacies that are almost on the level of nation states. And so the Germans are much more formidable now than they were 150 years prior. And so this is a long, bloody, protracted war in which Rome finally wins. But I'll get to that in a second with his son. There are a couple of Christian writers during Marcus's time. Melito of Sardis, we have an apology of his to the emperor that survives from this time. Athenagoras of Athens, and also Tatian the Syrian with his famous Diatessaron, which is a harmony of the four Gospels. And then tragically, Marcus dies of the Antonine Plague in 180 AD, and it's with his death that Cassius Dio says the Roman Empire went from being an empire of gold and marble to an empire of rust and iron. His son then takes over, and this is the beginning of a long and slow decline for the empire. Commodus, who is an infamous figure in Roman history, as depicted well by Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator, his reign is the end of the Pax Romana. He was the unworthy son of Marcus, and he was totally opposite from his father in so many ways. As soon as his father died, he concludes the war with the German tribes in a treaty and then immediately heads back to Rome to party. I guess he was tired of military life and decided that the good life in Rome was what he really wanted. So there were fewer wars during his father's reign, but a lot of palace intrigue. He developed a cult of personality, and it's really with him that he demands to be worshipped as a living god, which is very much against Roman tradition. He fought in the Colosseum as a gladiator. He saw himself as kind of the embodiment of Hercules. He renamed the city of Rome. I think it's Colonia Luciana, Commodiana, or something like that, which is literally the colony of Commodus. He renames the months of the year after his various cognomens that he has amassed for himself. He institutes a reign of terror over the Senate, assassinating many people, and he brought the empire to near bankruptcy with his profligacy. And he is finally strangled in his bath by his gladiator trainer in 192 AD. And Irenaeus wrote his Against Heresies during Commodus's reign. After Commodus's death, there's another civil war, the Year of the Five Emperors. And Septimius Severus is the governor of Pannonia, and he ultimately wins this war. He's married to a Syrian woman, and this is interesting because Christians actually have some level of toleration during the Severan dynasty. Now, Septimius persecuted Christians in his reign, but not as harsh as other emperors. However, during his reign, the empire began a long sort of trend of slow debasement of the currency to pay for an ever-enlarging army. And he had two sons, Lucius and Geta, one of whom is known by the nickname Lucius. Septimius Bassianus as the nickname Caracalla, which is another infamous name in Roman history. But on his deathbed, he tells his sons, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others." And the prolific early Christian writer Tertullian writes during the reign of Septimius Severus, well, his son Caracalla murders his brother Geta to become sole emperor. And Caracalla, some people say, is actually worse than Commodus was in terms of his cruelty and his violence. He saw himself as the second coming of Alexander the Great. He styled himself as a general emperor, and that presaged the future barrack emperors of the crisis period. And as you can see, here's a bust of him with this very menacing look. He was very much a thug and was less than competent as a ruler. However, there is an important piece of legislation that occurs during his reign, and that is the Edict of Caracalla, in which he grants citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire. And this has lasting consequences into the Middle Ages for the feudal system, which we'll discuss at later time. Anyways, there's a quick succession of emperors. His Praetorian prefect rules for a year, and then two of his younger cousins, Elagabalus and Alexander Severus, become emperors. And Severus Alexander was actually quite kindly disposed towards Christians. Origen of Alexandria, the early Christian writer, actually is invited into the palace and teaches the young Emperor Alexander Severus. However, he's kind of a mama's boy, and his mother is really involved in his reign, and he is assassinated by his troops in 235 for wanting to pay off the German barbarians instead of fighting them off. And it's with his death that the empire enters into a 50-year period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. And over the next 50 years, the empire saw 26 different men for an average of less than 2 years per reign, confirmed as emperor by the Senate. And that is besides usurpers. Rome, as I mentioned before, never resolved an orderly system of succession. And so these are the times of the barracks emperors, where powerful generals would depose their predecessor and become the new emperor. And so they never lived in the city of Rome, many of them. And so they were known as the barracks emperors because they lived on the frontiers. There's a change in imperial iconography during this time. Many of the coins shift from showing the soft laurel crown of the princeps to showing the hard, spiky metal radiate crown, which actually is a symbol of a domus. And the emperors are getting closer and closer to being worshipped as deities by the Roman people by this time. The capital itself is marginalized as the city of Rome is stuck down this big peninsula right here, and all of these frontiers are hard to get to from the city of Rome, and so new capitals are actually instituted by the various emperors. And there are many Christian martyrs during this era. And that is because the Roman emperors of the barracks period, or the crisis of the 3rd century, are from the army. They're not from the Senate. And so the army was the bastion of paganism and traditional Roman morality. And so these emperors hated Christianity by and large, because many Romans felt that because of the rise of Christianity and other religions like Manichaeism, the old gods had been neglected, and therefore the old gods had forsaken Rome, because Rome had forsaken them. And so many of the emperors tried to get the Roman citizens to go back to sacrificing to the old gods, and they increased the imperial cult. And it's for this reason that many Christians were put to death, not so much for what they did, but for what they wouldn't do, which was make a sacrifice to the old gods or to the genius of the emperor in the imperial cult. So Emperor Decius has the Decian persecution. About 10 years later, the Emperor Valerian has the Valerian persecution. Many Christians are killed. Cyprian of Carthage being a notable one among them. The empire actually splits in 3 for about 15 years, in which the empire has faced setbacks, especially in the east, against a resurgent Persia under the Sassanid dynasty, who had overthrown the prior Parthians. So Shapur I, the Shahanshah, or the King of Kings, actually captures the Emperor Valerian at the Battle of Edessa. And so Sassanid Persia is now seen as a peer imperial power to Rome. And so this sets off a chain reaction within the Roman Empire that leads nearly to its collapse during the 3rd century. However, a series of strong emperors, Aurelian being one of them, this is the bust of the Emperor Aurelian. It's under his reign that Valentine from St. Valentine's Day is martyred. Either him or Claudius Gothicus, who is right before him. But he reunites the empire. He defeats Palmyra, defeats the Gallic Empire, defeats the Goths who are starting to raid across the northern frontier. And he is proclaimed Restutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, by the Roman Senate. And he's actually the first emperor to be involved in a church affair. The heretical bishop Paul of Samosata is actually deposed by the church in Samosata, which is way out here in Cappadocia. And while Aurelian is campaigning against the Palmyrene Empire to reabsorb it into the Roman Empire, he actually deposes Paul and confirms the election of a new bishop by the people of Samosata. So a little interesting thing for Aurelian's reign. And don't worry, guys, not too much longer, just a few more slides, about 3 or 4 more. So to end the crisis and establish an orderly succession, the Emperor Diocletian, who defeated his predecessor Quirinus, appoints a co-Augustus to help him rule the empire in 284 AD. And furthermore, he establishes 2 junior emperors or Caesars to help him manage the empire. These are Galerius in the east and a man by the name of Constantius Chlorus in the west. Does the name Constantius ring a bell for anybody?
Constantinople.
You're on the right track. We'll get to that in a second.
Constantine.
So Constantius is not, well, we'll get to that in a second. So 4 new capitals are put. The empire is divided into 4 parts so that the 2 Augusti and their 2 Caesars can rule. Here is a depiction of the tetrarchs here. So you have 4 emperors ruling in a college of emperors. And in 305 AD, Diocletian and Maximian, his co-ruler, do something that was unthinkable in prior eras of Roman history, and that is that they abdicate the throne, trying to set a new precedent of 20-year terms for the emperors. However, this doesn't end the succession crisis. It was during Diocletian's reign that the final and greatest persecution of Christians by the empire occurs. Although Diocletian was the one who kind of oversaw it, it was really his Caesar Galerius, who was a staunch pagan, who really pushed the persecution. Galerius hated Christians, absolutely despised them, and stated in the ecclesiastical histories that Galerius wanted to burn every Christian that he could find alive. So on the 23rd of February, 303 AD, Diocletian orders the church building in his capital of Nicomedia razed, its scriptures burned, and its treasury seized. This was on the feast of the god Terminus, and the pagans at that time sought to terminate Christianity. Mass arrests of Christian clergy happened. There's at least 3,500 executions that are recorded, and those are only the ones that are recorded. There are indiscriminate massacres that have happened out in the provinces, especially down in Egypt. And there is a demand that the Christians must sacrifice to the old gods to restore the gods' favor to the empire. Even after Diocletian's abdication, Galerius presses on the persecution for another 6 years. However, eventually he realizes this is a hopeless cause because Christians just continue to multiply. Doesn't matter how many of them he beheads. Doesn't matter how many of them he runs through with spears. It doesn't matter how many of them he burns alive. They just keep growing. And so finally in 311, the old dying pagan emperor gives up and he issues the Edict of Serdica, which is where modern Sofia in Bulgaria is at. And he says, consequently, in accord with our indulgence, they, that is the Christians, ought to pray to their God for our health and the safety of the state, so that the state may be kept safe on all sides, and they may be able to live safely and securely in their own home. Because what he had come to realize is that Christians were actually among the best citizens that he had. Persecution in the East was revived shortly for a very brief period of time under Maximinus Daza until 313 AD. However, Daza is eventually overthrown by Constantine and Licinius, who then declare the Edict of Milan, which effectively legalizes Christianity. So, I mentioned Constantius Chlorus earlier. So he was the emperor in the West during the Tetrarchy. And while persecution raged in the eastern provinces, Constantius in the West was rather ambivalent towards the Christians. He kind of tore a couple of churches down just to say that he was persecuting people. There were a few Christians killed in the provinces, but it was relatively quiet and peaceful for Christians in the West. And Constantius had one son with his first wife, Helena. He named that son Constantine. He only reigned for 1 year as the supreme emperor in the West. And when he died in the city of Eberacum, which is modern day York in England, his troops hailed his son Constantine as Augustus. And so for the next 18 years, Constantine would consolidate his rule over the entire Roman Empire. And it's his rule that would mark not only a turning point in the empire, but also a turning point in global history. On the evening of the 27th of October, 312 AD, Constantine had marched his troops all the way down into the city of Rome itself to confront his rival, who was also his brother-in-law, Maxentius. And while Maxentius was inside the city of Rome, consulting with the Sibylline books and engaging in other pagan divination practices, Constantine was said to have witnessed a sign in the heavens in the shape of a cross. And he heard a voice say in Greek, "In Teutonica," which is translated into Latin, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. And so on the next day, October 28th, Maxentius's larger force, which was stationed on the Ponto Milvio, the Milvian Bridge, beheld a bewildering sight. And so as they were faced by Constantine's army, they noticed a strange symbol on the shields of Constantine's soldiers and a strange legionary standard. And that was the letters Chi and Rho, which were the first two letters of the Greek word Christus. This smaller force that Constantine commanded would rout Maxentius's pagan army. Maxentius drowns in the Tiber River in the rout. And so after this battle, Constantine would then convert to Christianity, and he then issues the Edict of Milan a year later. And after finally consolidating his rule over the entirety of the Roman Empire in 324 AD, he would then convoke the first ecumenical council just outside his newly built eastern capital of New Rome, which was subsequently called Constantinople. And so the first council was in a suburb of Constantinople called Nicaea. And so by the end of his reign, Christianity was ascendant throughout the empire, and Rome would only ever see one more pagan emperor. That was his nephew, Julian the Apostate. And what's interesting, one of the very messy points of Christian history is that Constantine was actually baptized not by a Nicene or Trinitarian bishop, but by an Arian bishop, Eusebius of Nicomedia, on his deathbed. And he had done so. He was by the time of his death, he had reunited the empire and had also effectively Christianized it. And so the later history of the empire, after Constantine's death, the empire would have relative stability for the next 70 years. But internecine Christian conflicts would kind of come to dominate imperial court politics. Theodosius I is the first truly Christian emperor in the sense that he makes Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. And he convokes the Second Ecumenical Council, the First Council of Constantinople. However, by the time we get to the 5th century, 400 AD, the political cohesion of the Western Empire began to fall apart. And so the empire had been split at Theodosius's death in 395 between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. And it's at this point that the Western Empire begins to collapse. 410, the Goths under Alaric sack the city of Rome. Here's the famous painting of the half-naked Germans, which is not at all what they would have looked like, trying to tear down a statue of a Roman emperor. The empire also withdraws from Britain during this time. You have a number of church councils, Ephesus, Chalcedon. There's a lot of sort of Christological controversy going on within the church at this time. Attila the Hun in 443 sweeps down from Asia and begins to assault the empire. And then the city of Rome is sacked for a second time by Gaiseric, the king of the Vandals. And then finally, in 476 AD, the Ostrogothic king Odoacer deposes the child emperor Romulus Augustulus, which is kind of a curious name. He was named after the founder of the city and after the founder of the empire, and yet he is the last ruler of the Western Empire. He is deposed by the Gothic king Odoacer, who then sends the imperial regalia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople. And there's a number of Christian writers who write during the later Roman Empire, and we'll get to them in time. But my favorite of these is Augustine of Hippo, who writes his famous work, The City of God, in response to the first sack of Rome. And it's really in this book that we see the theology that will come to dominate the Middle Ages and the medieval period. And so by the end of the 5th century, the world has transitioned, at least in the West, from classical antiquity into the medieval world. And so there's a coda as we finish up our lesson for tonight. Romanitas et Christianitas. Rome's attempts at universal empire culminated in what the early Christian writer Tertullian referred to as Romanitas, that is, Romanness. Romanitas was the Roman worldview and manner of living. It's defined the life of every pagan Roman. It involved honoring the mos maiorum, the tradition of the ancestors, living with gravitas, which was dignity, and pietas, which was piety towards the gods. Pagan Rome, in its long history of conquest and change, was able to absorb all sorts of local cults and cultures into Romanitas. However, its pretensions towards universal empire, which was mechanical and forced, ultimately failed in its aims. There truly was a terminus or a limit to Rome, not only geographically, but historically. And as the 5th century dawned, the last century of old Rome, Romanitas had given way to a new idea and a new view of the world that would come to dominate Europe in the medieval age, and that was Christianitas, or Christianness. This latter idea knew no bounds then and knows no bounds now, for its kingdom, unlike old Rome, is ever increasing in saecula saeculorum unto the ages of ages. So with that, one final quote from Philip Schaff as we leave off for tonight. The flower of paganism, with which we are concerned here, appears in the two great nations of classical antiquity, Greece and Rome. With the language, morality, literature, and religion of these nations, the apostles came directly into contact. And through the whole first age, the church moves on the basis of these nationalities. These, together with the Jews, were the chosen nations of the ancient world and shared the earth among them. The Jews were chosen for things eternal, to keep the sanctuary of the true religion. The Greeks prepared the elements of the natural culture, of science and art, for the use of the church. The Romans developed the idea of law and organized the civilized world into a universal empire, ready to serve the spiritual universality of the gospel. Both Greeks and Romans were unconscious servants of Jesus Christ, the unknown God. And with that, we end our foundations lessons on the Roman Empire and our foundation lessons for church history. And so next week we will be moving in to our study of church history proper. These lessons are going to get much shorter and probably just go an hour and a half in the future because we're going to kind of slow things down as we get into church history proper. And I want to make sure that we're taking good time to really kind of absorb each period and the lessons as we do them.